I'm Gleaves Whitney. This is a continuation of my video essay, The Joy of the Liberal Arts in a Pandemic and Beyond. Chapter 3, Opening Wide Our Aperture. The study of philosophy, intellectual history, and psychology challenges students to open their mental aperture. When you open the aperture of a camera lens, it lets in more light. In class, I illustrate the importance of having a wider aperture using Pierre Leconte-Denouil's plumb bob exercise. A carpenter framing a house uses a plumb bob to establish that two stud walls are vertically parallel. Despite what the plumb bob is telling the carpenter, it's not lying, the walls are not actually parallel, but rather two radii pointing to the center of the earth. Aperture matters. Perspective matters. Don't we need leaders and policymakers who see the big picture? To illustrate, as of this video, April 18th, 2020, some 38,000 people in the United States have died of COVID-19. The scale of death is heartbreaking, but hardly ever factored in are the additional deaths that are likely to occur from suicide, substance abuse, and heart disease when people lose their jobs. Writes former New York Lieutenant Governor Betsy McKay, every 1% hike in the unemployment rate will likely produce a 3.3% increase in drug overdose deaths and a 0.99% increase in suicides. That's according to data from the National Bureau of Economic Research and the medical journal Lancet. These are facts based on past experience, not models. If unemployment hits 32%, some 77,000 Americans are likely to die from suicide and drug overdoses as a result of layoffs. Deaths of despair. Close quote. Now that's double the number of people who have thus far died from the coronavirus in the U.S. as of April 18th. The point is lost unless one's aperture is wide open. Perspective makes all the difference between good and bad risk assessment. Taught well, the liberal arts instill respect for intellectual diversity, whether from the left and the party of innovation or from the right and the party of conservation. At their core, the liberal arts apply methodological diversity to meet the demands of intellectual rigor. Point and counterpoint, sic and non, pro and con, tertium quid. Leaders who are lifelong learners welcome multiple perspectives on the most critical issues we collectively face. As a result, they acquire the good habit of not critically accepting the first information they receive or the first answer they hear. They're not credulous. As I write, there is a furious investigation to try and find out whether the coronavirus originated in a Wuhan wet market, as Chinese officials maintain, or in a government virology lab, as U.S. intelligence analysts suspect. The implications are enormous. If the former, then the coronavirus is a natural disaster and no one's to blame. But if the latter, then the Chinese regime is possibly culpable for hundreds of thousands of deaths worldwide and trillions of dollars in economic damages besides. Missouri has already sued the Chinese. Truth matters. There can be no justice without truth. A good liberal education helps students speak with their minds and listen with their hearts. We could all develop more empathy, which is the emotional intelligence to identify with the other. A vivid case study, a moving novel, a riveting story, a powerful work of art or music, all expand our emotional repertoire and remind us never to leave the human factor out of our calculations. When I train a diverse group of students to find common ground with one another, I pair them off and ask them to tell at least 3 core stories that define who they are. Without fail, people who start the exercise believing that they are irreconcilably different from their table mate find unexpected points of convergence. They connect emotionally and often make a new friend. Does anyone doubt that EQ and empathy are critical for policymakers and democratic leaders who are making decisions on behalf of the rest of us? At the same time, practice of the liberal arts teaches students about the space between receiving another's communication and giving our response to it. We all know what it's like to talk to someone who's not really listening but just reloading as we speak. Well, moderated classroom discussion can instantiate the habit of being quick to listen, slow to disagree, and eager to understand. A good liberal arts education exposes students to the dangers of hubris or excessive pride. Reading the historian Thucydides makes us alive to the known unknowns and unknown knowns when we must choose a course of action. But there are also unknown unknowns. Hubris Exuberant hubris can lead people to be heedless of the law of unintended consequences, for example. Pericles was arguably the greatest leader Athens ever had. He was reputedly the most incorruptible. But after he ordered every inhabitant to come inside the city walls during the long war with Sparta, the Peloponnesian War, a plague broke out. It killed 1/4 of the population. Once plucky Athens, the polis that had turned back the mighty Persian Empire, the superpower of its day, was forever weakened by a good man's bad decision. Athens would eventually lose the war. Pericles, in his pride, did not think he could make such a big mistake. Despite his storied eloquence, the plague had the last word. It ended his political career and also his life. This cautionary tale reminds me of a story about General George Marshall, who, upon learning he was being nominated for Secretary of State, was asked how he would prepare to serve in a tempestuous world. Quote, "I'm going home and reading my Thucydides." Close quote. The law of unintended consequences has asserted itself throughout history. Who knew that when Muslims began shutting down Christian commerce in the Mediterranean Sea, a whole new world, the Americas, would open up to Europeans in search of alternate routes to the east? Who knew that when an obscure monk nailed 95 theses to a church door, it would kick off a civilizational break within fortress Christendom? Who knew that a depression in the late 1920s would strengthen war-bent fascists in the 1930s, leading to the most devastating carnage in world history? During the last few decades, despite a stable of PhDs, relatively few experts predicted such world historical events as the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, 9/11, the Great Recession of 2008, the Arab Spring, the rise of ISIS, the election of Donald Trump, or this, the coronavirus pandemic. Who would have doubted that we could all use a little bit more humility? This concludes Chapter 3 of my video essay, The Joy of the Liberal Arts in a Pandemic. I invite you now to watch Chapter 4. Thanks for dropping in.